So you're very welcome back, Emma. This was an event that we recorded, I believe, on the 16th, wasn't it?
It was.
But unfortunately, due to a technical glitch, we didn't get the live recording. So Emma has very, very kindly agreed to come back and re-record it so as that we can have a recording for the blog, and people who are interested can access it there. Okay, so Emma Lundy, you're a behaviour specialist with Rehab Care, and you completed this research as part of your master's in TCD.
That's right.
Master's in ABA and TCD. Excellent. And was published in the September issue of the European Journal of Behaviour Analysis. Okay, excellent. And the title of the paper is Evaluating the Utility of Interview-Informed Synthesized Contingent Analysis in Informing the Treatment of Problem Behaviour amongst Children with an Autistic Spectrum Disorder.
Yes,
I got that right.
Rolls off the tongue. Yeah,
I got it right this time.
Thank you. Well done.
Okay, so like as those of us in the community will know that the means of completing functional assessment and functional analysis have evolved over the years, and kind of most commonly what we think of as behavioral analysts when thinking of functional analysis is probably the IISCA form of functional analysis. Now, as you point out in your paper, there can be barriers to implementation with that type of functional analysis because of the resources. So the IISCA, or the interview-informed or the practical functional assessment, seeks to address some of those practical issues, isn't that?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, great. So if we hand over to you now, Emma, and you can take it away and demonstrate, show us what you found.
Super. Yeah, will do. Brilliant. Okay. Let's see. Yeah. Is that all okay?
Looks good. Yeah, it's coming along nicely.
Perfect.
I'll mute myself now, but I'll be here if you need me. Give me a shout.
Perfect. Thanks. I'll jump in anyway. Yeah. So as you said, the title of the paper is Evaluating the Utility of Interview-Informed Synthesized Contingency Analysis Informing the Treatment of Problem Behaviour Among Children with Autism Spectrum Disorder. It was conducted in TCD and on site then in Abacus Special School in Kilbarrack as well. It was where the research was conducted. So that's the paper, and the DOI is down below. But Alan, I think you had sent a copy to people who had signed up anyway. If anybody, if anybody wants a copy and can't get it, my email address is on the last slide, I think. So I'm happy to send it to anybody.
Might pop a link up on the blog as well afterwards, so people will be able to see it. You can go full screen there as well, Emma. On your.
Sorry, I thought I was, but I'll try again. Is that doing it there?
No, there should be a present button down the bottom there, and that'll make it go bigger again.
Do you know what? It might be because of the way that I shared it. Sorry, again, I'll do the entire screen.
We can. It's visible, so it's not.
Perfect. A big deal. It's much better. Big. Is that better?
There we go.
There we go. Lovely. Yeah, way better this way. Perfect. All right. So then I suppose the background for the study came from the literature on problem behaviour, behaviours of challenge, behaviours of concern. To be consistent with the rest of the research in this area, I'll be going with the term problem behaviour, as I say, just for consistency's sake. So in terms of the prevalence of problem behaviour among autistic people, we have a few estimates of that. So this study then from 2011, which was conducted in Ireland, found that 93.7% of 3 to 14-year-olds with autism spectrum disorder exhibited problem behaviour. Almost half of the sample engaged in self-injury, more than half engaged in aggressive behaviour, and 92% engaged in interfering stereotypy. That was obviously interfering with their other goals and quality of life. And all three of those topographies then occurred together for more than 1/3 of the sample. So fairly prevalent, a fairly common issue, something that we as behaviour analysts see all the time. Usually then to address problem behaviour, we use a process called functional behaviour assessment. So we know that that's when we identify the environmental variables that influence an individual's problem behaviour. So in terms of the effectiveness then of functional behaviour assessment in general, this study from about 5 years ago meta-analysed 12 studies reporting the effects of interventions that were based on functional behaviour assessment compared with interventions that weren't. And they found that the interventions that were based on functional behaviour assessment were associated with large reductions in problem behaviour and large increments in appropriate behaviour. So in addition to giving us much more effective treatments, functional behaviour assessment also gives us a way of dignifying our treatment processes, because it incorporates the person's unique learning history and environment into treatment plans that are personally relevant for them, as opposed to something like behaviour modification, a one-size-fits-all kind of an approach. So we have a few methods then of functional behaviour assessment. The first would be indirect functional behaviour assessment. So that would be things like interviews, checklists, questionnaires, rating scales, where you're not directly observing the problem behaviour itself. These instruments in general have been found in the literature to have poor reliability and validity. Many of us who have used them in practice would have seen that quite often. One person will rate something much higher on one scale than on another, and the opposite for somebody else, or even the same person over different points in time might give you very different answers. So because of that, then the data that arise from indirect FBA can often fail to endorse any hypothesis regarding the function of the behaviour. It can strongly endorse all of the possible hypotheses, or it can indicate conflicting endorsements across raters. So because of that, then the utility of those data is often fairly poor. Another approach then is your descriptive functional behaviour assessment, so where you're observing the problem behaviour directly, things like ABC charts, scatter plots, things like that. These approaches then rely on correlational data that highlight prevalent environmental events regardless of their relevance. So that could be an issue in terms of the utility of the data in particular. Many researchers at this stage have argued that severe problem behaviour that's worth intervening on always attracts attention. If somebody is hurting themselves, hurting other people, chances are somebody else is going to notice. So because attention is quite often a consequence for these kinds of behaviours, there is a temporal relation that may mask then more functional relations between the target behaviour that we're interested in and environmental variables that might be less prevalent but more relevant. So a common everyday example is that usually if you sneeze, somebody will say bless you, but you're not sneezing to achieve the outcome of somebody saying bless you. It's a prevalent event that isn't necessarily relevant. So then the only approach that we have that can determine whether or not there is a functional relationship or a relevance between the environmental variables and behaviour is functional analysis. So generally the way that we would conduct functional analysis is we have a multi-element design where we have multiple test conditions in which the suspected antecedents and consequences are present, and a control condition in which those environmental variables are absent. So what we would like to show is that the condition that shows the highest frequency or duration of problem behaviour represents then the primary maintaining variables, because when that variable was being manipulated, behaviour was occurring more often. So the model, as Alan mentioned, that has been generally followed in the past was developed by Brian Iwata and his colleagues in the 80s and then republished in the 90s. So in their model, there were 4 test conditions. They had social disapproval, so to test for an attention function, academic demand to test for an escape function, unstructured play as the control condition, and then alone to test for automatic reinforcement. So each of their sessions lasted 15 minutes. They ran 8 sessions, so 2 per condition every day. And the order of those conditions was determined by random drawing to control for sequence effects, that kind of a thing. And they continued until either they found stability in the level of self-injury, and there were unstable levels of responding across 5 days in all conditions, or they had 12 days of sessions that were completed. So just something to note there is that there were 8 sessions of 15 minutes per day, so that was 2 hours a day. So they either stopped after 5 days of unstable levels of responding, or until 12 days of sessions were completed. So that could be up to 24 hours of analysis. So just a description of each of those conditions then. So in the free play control condition, they had no task demands, there was intermittent attention, and the child was playing with their preferred toys. The idea was that there were no establishing operations, no triggers for problem behaviour to occur, and there were no program consequences for that behaviour either. In the attention condition, the child was told to play alone. The adult was present, but ignoring the child. So the idea being, if the problem behaviour was attention maintained and attention wasn't available, problem behaviour was more likely to occur. And then if it did occur, attention was delivered contingent on that behaviour, and no other consequences were delivered. Some standard functional analyses that have been conducted since the original study have included the tangible conditions. So there will be intermittent adult attention, and there will be preferred item visible but out of reach and no task demands. So then similar to the other conditions, in this condition, the suspected consequence is delivered contingent on problem behaviour, so the preferred item in this case. And after a set time, then it's removed and another trial would begin. In the demand condition, then a difficult task is presented, and if problem behaviour occurs, the task is removed contingent on that. And then in the alone or ignore condition, the child is left alone without any toys or materials. The adult is either in the room or just outside, and there are no program consequences. So the idea being that if behaviour is occurring under those conditions, then automatic reinforcement would be suspected. So the standard model then that had been developed by Iwata and his colleagues was very important. It had a lot of advantages. It inspired a shift from behaviour modification, as I mentioned, that kind of one-size-fits-all approach, to behaviour analytic interventions that were focused on weakening those maintaining response reinforcer relationships and strengthening functionally equivalent replacement behaviours. So as I said, very personally relevant and dignifying as well. The generality of the procedures then have been replicated, extended and discussed in more than 2,000 articles and chapters that are summarised in these two reviews. And they would have found that over 90% of the analysis that were reported in the literature yielded differentiated outcomes. They were highly likely to identify the function of behaviour. And then treatments that are informed by functional analysis have been found to result in greater behavioural suppression in the case of problem behaviour. So because of that, they've become the gold standard for functional behaviour assessment because of the results that they yield. However, as Alan mentioned, there are some limitations of the standard functional analysis, the biggest one being that many people don't use it. This study from 2015 found that 63% of 724 behaviour analysts never or almost never conducted functional analysis, and another study from the same year found that more than half of respondents reported descriptive assessment alone to be sufficient, even though, as we saw, the literature underlying descriptive assessment isn't very positive. There are some commonly reported limitations that might lead to those outcomes, namely the functional analysis is time consuming. As I mentioned in the original study, they ran 24 hours of analysis over 12 days. That's resource intensive. It requires a lot of people, a lot of time, specific items and locations quite often as well. People report a lack of support from stakeholders, understandably so, because if you're putting somebody in situations that you're expecting to evoke problem behaviour for a total of 24 hours, there is some understandable questioning of the safety and the necessity of that as well. And the risk, like that, if you are purposely trying to evoke problem behaviour, there can be some risks involved in that as well, which would be another disadvantage. On top of that, then, if we look at the rates of differentiation in clinical practice rather than in the published literature, this study from 2013 that was conducted in the Kennedy Krieger Center over in the States, they looked at the initial functional analysis outcomes and then modifications in pursuit of differentiation for 176 of their inpatients in unit for severe problem behaviour. So in the first instance, the standard procedure yielded differentiated outcomes or identified the function of the behaviour in less than half of cases. And then in another 40% of cases, there was differentiation as a result of the modifications that they made. So what that indicates is that in practice, people might not be seeing the above 90% chance of differentiation of identifying the function of the behaviour that had been reported in the literature. So if the outcomes are like that, insufficiently reinforcing for practitioners, in addition to the high response effort, the limitations that we discussed a second ago, it's understandable then why practitioners may not be motivated to conduct the standard functional analysis. So to address some of those limitations, there have been some variations of functional analysis that have been developed, and they're summarized in this paper. And some of them would be the brief functional analysis, latency functional analysis, precursor functional analysis, trial-based functional analysis, and then functional analysis with protective equipment. So in all of these variations, generally there would still be a test condition looking at attention and escape, probably tangible reinforcement as well, probably automatic reinforcement. So the reinforcement contingencies tend to mirror those described by Iwata and his colleagues. So they're very much tweaks of the original procedure in terms of maybe the dimension of behaviour that's of interest, or looking at precursors, that kind of thing. So Greg Hanley is the originator of the synthesized contingency analysis approach, and he first described the procedures in 2012. His argument was that if you include idiosyncratic variables, those modifications in function analysis from the beginning, rather than as a reaction to an undifferentiated standard analysis, you're likely to enhance the efficiency, ecological validity, and clinical utility of your analysis. And then furthermore, that the standard function analysis breaks natural contingencies of reinforcement apart in unnatural ways. So by breaking reinforcement down into attention or escape or tangible or sensory reinforcers, you are kind of fracturing natural synthesized reinforcers that occur in the environment. So we're able to demonstrate causal relationships between environmental events and behavior without isolating possible controlling contingencies into those multiple test conditions that you compare to an omnibus control condition. So in other words, you don't need to do it the standard way in order to identify the maintaining reinforcers for the behavior. So the alternative then is, according to this approach, is to conduct a 30-minute open-ended interview to discover potentially relevant environmental variables and then demonstrate the influence of those variables through a 30-minute individualized test control analysis. So in this model, rather than having one control condition compared to 3 or 4 distinct test conditions, you've got one control condition and one test condition, the only difference between the two being that the test condition contains a contingency that's been designed to replicate the behavior-environment interactions that were described during the interview. So it's highly idiosyncratic from the beginning. You speak to somebody who knows the person well, find out what they believe to be important to the person in terms of maintaining their problem behavior, and then you replicate that in an analysis altogether, as opposed to trying to break it apart into different distinct reinforcers. So like that, you synthesize idiosyncratic establishing operations, behaviors, and reinforcers, and we'll see what that looks like in just a second as well. So just then to directly compare some of the aspects of the isolated or standard function analysis versus this new model, the synthesized model. In your isolated analysis, you are looking at one establishing operation per test condition. In the synthesized model, the test condition includes multiple establishing operations that are synthesized together. So instead of looking at escape or attention in a standard analysis, you might be looking at escape to attention as a potential establishing operation and reinforcer as well. In the isolated analysis, generally you're looking at one problem behavior. So you would do, like as in the original study, a function analysis of self-injury, whereas in synthesized analysis, problem behaviors are also synthesized. So all topography is a problem behavior, as well as all precursors are synthesized together, the assumption being that all of a person's problem behavior is maintained by the same reinforcement contingency. The person doesn't use self-injury for one thing, aggression for another, and they're in the same response class. As I mentioned then, in the isolated analysis, you might have one reinforcer, so the person might receive attention or escape from demand, whereas in the synthesized analysis, all of the suspected reinforcers are synthesized, so the person would escape to attention in a form that's meaningful to them. As I mentioned, the isolated or the standard analysis has multiple test conditions, whereas the synthesized analysis just has one. In the standard analysis, those test conditions are uniform. You use the same materials generally and the same format with everybody, whereas in the synthesized analysis, they're individualized, idiosyncratic, based on the results of what caregivers have told you. And in the isolated analysis, you have just the toy play control, whereas in the synthesized analysis, it's intimately matched with the test condition. So whatever is present in terms of being manipulated in the test condition is available non-contingently in the control condition. So you're only looking at the contingency as the difference between the two. And just something that I think is important to mention at this point is to really highlight how that kind of synthesis of the establishing operations, the behaviors, and the reinforcers increases safety in the analysis, given that that's such a big limitation of the standard analysis. An important function of reinforcement, we know that reinforcement increases future responding, but reinforcement also functions to turn behavior off in the moment. When the person gets what they want, they stop looking for it. So if you only deliver part of the reinforcement contingency, so if you only provide escape or only provide attention, we'll say, some of those establishing operations may continue to operate if there are multiple reinforcers for that behavior. So if you synthesize all of the suspected reinforcement contingencies and immediately deliver them for any member of the response class, not just dangerous problem behavior, but also precursors, and any form of dangerous or non-dangerous problem behavior, you're likely to turn that behavior off very quickly, which is integral then to safety. So that is why that inference that precursors and problem behavior are maintained by the same reinforcers, excuse me, is so important. And there is literature to support that inference as well that has compared the function of precursors and more severe problem behavior. So just a note on that, on why this approach to analysis addresses many of the limitations, including, most importantly, safety of the standard analysis. Okay. So then all of this was combined into what's called the interview-informed synthesized contingency analysis, which is a fairly cumbersome name. More recently, you'll see it referred to as the practical functional assessment. So that refers to the entire process of the interview and then the analysis. So the IISCA is still a thing, but it's incorporated into the practical functional assessment. It was first applied in this study in 2014. Greg Hanley and his colleagues used these procedures with 3 participants who engaged in high levels of screaming and aggression. They ran these individualized test control analysis that were informed by the results of those open-ended caregiver interviews, and they found differentiated results for all of their participants. And then they implemented what's now known as skill-based treatment, an intervention involving functional communication and delay and denial tolerance training. And they found those treatments to eliminate the problem behavior for all 3 participants, and they were found to be socially valid as well. A review then of all of the different replications of that study up to 2020 found that the analysis on average have been 25 minutes. 89% of those have had strong experimental control, and all of the treatments in the literature had produced 90 to 100% reductions in problem behavior. So compared to potentially 24 hours, I think the average function analysis is somewhere around 2 to 2.5 hours at least. Don't quote me on that, but it's longer than 25 minutes is the idea. So again, speaking to that, for those problems around resources, around safety, 25 minutes is much more optimal, especially when you're producing these kind of outcomes in terms of behavioral function, but then also more importantly, function-based treatment. Of the 90 participants then that were included in the studies that this review included, only one of those participants had been diagnosed with an intellectual disability, and 75% of the participants communicated vocally. So when we were looking to conduct our own research, that was a gap that stood out to us. And there were also limited data on generalization of behavior change, and also treatment acceptability. And there were no data on treatment fidelity in relation to the skill-based treatment that was described in the original study. And the reason why that's particularly important is because there are critics of this approach to function analysis, people who prefer the standard approach. And most often, critics will argue that if you include all of these different contingencies together, you're likely to identify functionally irrelevant contingencies that are not actually important to maintaining problem behavior. And then if you include those functionally irrelevant contingencies, you are likely to produce treatments that are imprecise, complex, and cumbersome. And the suggestion then is less effective. Now, no research had or still has compared the extent to which interventions informed by standard and synthesized analysis are cumbersome or not. But up to this point, nobody had looked at treatment fidelity. So like that, the argument was there that people weren't going to be able to implement these treatments properly, but nobody had checked that. So that was something that stood out to us as well. So in terms of our research questions for the study then, we wanted to see whether the IISCA was an efficient and effective model for determining the functions of problem behavior among children with autism spectrum disorder, and more specifically, those with intellectual disabilities who are non-vocal. We wanted to evaluate whether the skill-based treatment process that was described in the original study was effective in eliminating problem behavior as well. And then also we wanted to evaluate the extent to which those procedures were acceptable, and also implemented with fidelity to fill in some of those gaps in the literature to that point. So the participants then were Alex, James, and Reese in terms of their pseudonyms. Alex and James were 6 and Reese was 7. They had all been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disabilities, and James had also received a diagnosis of global developmental delay. And they were all non-vocal. Alex and James used PECs, and Reese used Proloco to go on an iPhone. Their problem behaviour then, all of them exhibited self-injury, and so the different topographies are listed there, and aggression, so severe problem behaviour for all 3 boys. For the assessment procedure, I ran the open-ended interview with the class teacher. All the participants were in the same class. The interviews only took 10 minutes for me because Abacus in Kilbarrack is a very strong behaviour analytics school, where everybody is very much aware of the functions of behaviour, that kind of thing. So the teacher was very quickly able to tell me the antecedents and the consequences that surrounded problem behaviour for the 3 boys. They were 10 minutes each. I observed each participant in their classroom for 15 minutes. That was a part of the original procedure. It's since been removed, but I found it helpful to be able to just observe what was naturally occurring before jumping into the analysis. Then for the analysis, during the control condition, the participants had contingent and non-contingent access to all of the reinforcers that their teacher had described. So for all 3 participants, their teacher described escape 2 tangibles as being the synthesized reinforcement contingency. So during the control condition of all of the IISCAs, there were no demands presented and there was free access to all preferred items. And then in the test sessions, they began with the arrangement of the suspected establishing operation. So the tangibles were removed and the demand was placed. If problem behavior occurred, all of those reinforcers, so escape and tangibles, were provided for 30 seconds and the establishing operation was begun again to start a new trial. For the treatment procedure then, it began with simple functional communication training, where the participants were taught an appropriate communication response to replace problem behaviour. In the skill-based treatment model, if the reinforcement contingency is synthesized, the participant is taught what's called an omnibus mand. So in contrast to a specific mand where you're asking for a break or asking for toys, an omnibus mand does not specify the reinforcer. It indicates that you want your synthesized reinforcement contingency altogether. So generally my way is the standard omnibus mand that you would use as part of the skill-based treatment protocol. Participants were first taught to ask for my way with a simple response. Then we moved on to complex functional communication training, where we were making that response more complex and more developmentally appropriate, which you'll see in the progression video that I have lined up in a second. And then once the participants could request their reinforcers, we began to teach them to tolerate delays and denials to those reinforcers. And then we pinned the reinforcement and lengthened those delays and denials using a chain schedule with differential reinforcement of alternative behaviour, essentially requiring the participants to complete more and more responses before the reinforcement, the synthesized reinforcer was delivered. So generally, this treatment can be described as teaching communication skills, coping skills, and cooperation skills while you're waiting for your reinforcer to be available. I should mention as well, I know there was a question when we originally ran the talk about how much time you spend in treatment and what you do when you're not in treatment. I ran 3 sessions a day with each participant, which added up to about an hour a day, 5 days a week. And there are different dosages that you can implement. And I'll be referencing training later on that goes through that. But generally, for us, when the treatment wasn't ongoing, it was business as usual. It was just a normal school day. Whereas some people prefer to take a more non-contingent reinforcement approach, and when the person is not practicing the skills in treatment, they have non-contingent access to all of the reinforcers, just to make sure that problem behaviour is very unlikely to be evoked, say if somebody's in crisis or similar. So there are different approaches, but the official training goes through all of that as well. So I have a progression video of one of the participants then going through. So each of the stages is kind of marked just to flag then that, so we have the analysis first, and then for each of the treatment stages, well, for the simple and complex communication responses and the tolerance response, There is first a clip of a fully prompted response and then an independent response, just to indicate how teaching was accomplished in that case. So this is the analysis first. And you'll see what I mean by the escape to tangibles being the reinforcer. So when the tangibles was removed and demand was placed, problem behavior occurred. That was prompted. So a more appropriate response was exchanging a picture from the wall. And then the terminal communication response was exchanging a picture from a wristband so that way it would be portable. So then he was presented with a denial clue and taught to tolerate that. So after he learned to fold his hands in his lap to tolerate, then we pinned the delay. So shoes and socks on had been described as a very potent establishing operation for this participant at the beginning. That was the first demand that we targeted then. That was 3 demands and just progressively increased from there. And the terminal demand was 13 trials.
Can I just come in for a second there?
Yeah, of course.
So what we're seeing here is this little boy has the My Way on his sleeve the whole time throughout that.
That's right.
Yeah, so like at any point, he can pick that off.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And he's learned at this point to that once that communication is denied and he exhibits that then coping response, then the reinforcers will be delivered once he's cooperated with the specified number of trials. So like that, by building up that cooperation repertoire very slowly, you're kind of, in a way, like colloquially, that phase is often referred to as building trust, because it's like it will come back, but just, you know, work for a little bit. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, now he's back here somewhere, I think. Perfect.
Good. He's back to his safe place now.
Yeah, shoes and socks off. He knew it was coming back. You can see a real, like anytime I have run the procedures, you can see a real, like once it clicks, there is kind of a sigh of relief, because it's not frantically wondering like that, when is it going to come back? There is that trust that, you know, it will, once those skill repertoires are really strong. So like that, you can see in him from going from not being able to respond to that establishing operation with anything other than the problem behavior, and then that being replaced with the communication, the coping when the reinforcers weren't available, and then the cooperation while you're waiting for the reinforcers to become available. So seeing it kind of spliced up, now it was 2 months it took to get there, but when you see it spliced up into, you know, 6 minutes, you know, you can really see the progression there in that way.
Yeah. So thank you. Sorry to interrupt. You have some graphs. You have assessment results here now.
All right. I'll jump into the graphs anyway. The best bit. We have the assessment results for Alex, the first participant. So you can see we ran one analysis with Alex, and we did not see any problem behavior in 2 consecutive test sessions, which indicated that we didn't have the reinforcement contingency right. At that point, he was during the control condition at his desk with his preferred reinforcers, and those fluffy toys that you saw in the video. So he was just at his desk, preferred reinforcers, no demands. For the test session, we were going in requesting relinquishment of those reinforcers and placing demands. And again, didn't see that evoking any problem behavior. So we had to go back to the drawing board, speak to his tutors who knew him the best, and they said that they had the most trouble when he had been in the break area on that beanbag that you saw, with all of the fluffy toys and his shoes and socks off, that going in and terminating that reinforcement context was very challenging for him. So we redesigned the analysis, went in again for the first test session again. We saw no problem behavior, but then in 3 consecutive test sessions, there were much higher levels of problem behavior compared to the 0 in the control condition, which is what you saw in the analysis. So when we were going in and interrupting that reinforcement contingency, we were evoking problem behavior quite quickly. Indicating that we had control over the behavior. In that case, we were able to turn it on by removing the reinforcers and turn it off by returning them, and that indicated that we had a very motivating context to teach those skills. If we had tried to teach at his desk, he wouldn't have been bothered because he didn't mind when that was interrupted as much. So that was the important part of the analysis for him, is finding that motivation. For James, then, the first analysis that we conducted with him, he was at his desk with his preferred reinforcers. He enjoyed toys and books, like action figures and books. And we found that there was 0 problem behavior in the first control condition and very little in the second, compared to high levels in the 3 test sessions, indicating again that we had identified that motivating context for him. And for Reese as well, he was the same. He had his reinforcers, so usually an iPad or sensory toys at his desk. No problem behavior in the control condition when those were non-contingently available with no demands, and then much higher levels of problem behavior in the test sessions, again indicating that we had identified the reinforcement contingency for him. In terms of treatment results then for Alex, you can see here problem behavior. The baseline is from those analyses. In the first simple communication training session, there was a bit potentially of an extinction burst there, where there were higher levels of problem behavior, but then for the remainder of treatment, we were seeing very low levels of any problem behavior, and it was 0 for most sessions. and that included during the treatment extension. So those arrows, M would be the maintenance session, NS is novel stimulus, and NT was a novel tutor who he brought in to run the procedures as well. For his simple and complex communication responses, you can see here that, so each of the lines obviously indicates phase lines. The graphs are much nicer when you can see them all on one page, such as they are in the paper, but you can see here that the simple communication response, the first one, that tapping the picture in my hand, wasn't occurring at all, obviously, in the analysis during baseline, but began to occur independently as soon as we began to teach it in that first phase. And then he met the criterion and moved on to that second communication response, which was exchanging the picture from the wall. And again, that began to increase once we began to teach it. And then Alex met criterion. And then for the complex communication response, again, that exchanging the picture from the wristband, that replaced the earlier communication responses. And you can see here on the graph, it did continue to occur throughout the treatment, the reinforcement thinning phase. It looks as though the rate was decreasing, which it was, but that was because our treatment sessions consisted of, I believe, 10 trials. But as reinforcement, as the schedule of reinforcement was thinned, each trial became longer because the participant had to cooperate with more and more demands before the reinforcement was reinstated. So treatment sessions went from being maybe 10 minutes up to maybe 20 minutes. But there were still 10 opportunities to communicate within those. So the actual rate was lower, but the response was occurring at the maximum level of opportunity anyway, just to make that clear. And then in terms of extension, the terminal communication response did occur for Alex during the maintenance probe after 4 weeks. It didn't occur during the probe with the novel stimulus. For him, he was in the school's playground, I believe. And it did occur with the novel tutor. And then for his tolerance response, that folding his hands on his lap, which he kind of morphed into tapping the wristband again, which was okay, just once he had a response to those delay and denial signals. It took about 6 sessions for that to begin occurring independently once we began to teach it. But then once he had mastered it, it continued to occur again at the maximum level of opportunity throughout the treatment. And it did occur then during all of the generalization probes as well. There was a question during the original talk about why the tolerance response may have taken longer to get off the ground than the communication responses. And my best guess is that it's because there are fewer opportunities to practice the tolerance response per session, because when you are teaching those coping skills, tolerating those no, not this time, wait signals, you are only giving those signals 60% of the time, so in 6 out of every 10 trials. But in 4 out of every 10 trials, you are still reinforcing the communication response to make sure that that is maintained, but also then to start building up this idea of unpredictability, that the participant doesn't know exactly what to expect next, so they're more flexible. So that's why there were only 60% of trials included an opportunity to learn the tolerance response during this phase. So it took a little bit longer, I think, to become independent then. For James, you can see as well, his problem behaviour was much lower during the whole treatment process than it had been during the analysis at baseline. Again, most of his treatment sessions had 0 problem behaviour, and that maintained then during the probes. For him, the simple communication response was exchanging the picture, the My Way picture from his desk. We didn't use the tapping the picture in my hand for James. For Alex, that was advised by his BCBA, who thought it might be too big of a jump to go straight to an exchange. But for James, we went straight to an exchange. He began to emit that response independently during the very first treatment session, and again continued until he met criterion. We replaced that then with exchanging the picture from the wristband, and again began to get that straight away independently. And again, that was occurring at the maximum level of opportunity throughout the reinforcement thinning phase. For him, again, it did occur during the maintenance and novel tutor generalization probes, but not the novel stimulus probe. And again, for James's tolerance response, which was also folding his hands in his lap, it took a few sessions to get off the ground, and then once it did, it was generally occurring at the maximum level of opportunity, and it did occur during the treatment extension phase as well. For Reese, the graphs are less clean. This is his problem behaviour, so you can see here that it was extremely variable. There are some explanations, potential explanations for that I'll get into when we get into the discussion section. But you can see here that while he did meet the criterion, so 3 consecutive sessions with no problem behaviour to move on, for functional communication training and that tolerance response training. Problem behavior is still very variable, so it hadn't been suppressed in the same way it had for the other participants. He began to emit his functional communication response, which was just My Way, emitted using his Proloco to Go app. Straight away as soon as we began to teach it, and again that was occurring at high levels throughout the remainder of the treatment. Did occur during the maintenance and new tutor probes, but not again the novel stimulus generalization probe. And his tolerance response again took a little bit longer to establish, but once it had been established, it was occurring consistently during the reinforcement thinning phase. In terms of treatment fidelity then, you can see here that on average, treatment fidelity was 94.6%, so people were implementing the treatment correctly. And for treatment acceptability, we used a scale called the TARF-R, the Treatment Acceptability Rating Form Revised, and tutors rated the intervention 105 out of 119. So again, it was also highly acceptable, as well as being easy to implement with fidelity. So in terms of what those results mean, generally the results are consistent with previous findings that had supported the efficiency and the effectiveness of the IISCA and then the associated skill-based treatment. The treatment reduced problem behaviour for Alex and James, and it strengthened communication and tolerance skills for all participants. As we saw, Reese's problem behaviour didn't seem to be sensitive to the treatment in the same way. And the best explanation that I have for that is that it may have been because his communication response was too complicated. As I mentioned, he just had one, and it was pressing the My Way button on his Proloco to Go device. So it's possible that a picture-based communication response similar to Alex's and James's would have been more appropriate for him as well. Alternatively, in the new kind of iterations of this process, it generally represents something that's called a performance-based IISCA. And this study from this year is the first study to have mentioned it in the literature so far. But anybody, if you complete the official trainings from this research group, you'll see it described more fully there. But the idea being that instead of providing reinforcement for 30 seconds, regardless of the person's behavior, you vary the reinforcement interval and determine it by whether or not the person is happy, relaxed, and engaged. So perhaps if we've been looking at Reese's behavior and his performance and making our decisions based off that, we would have been more successful than following the more time-based model that was kind of best practice at the time. So if we were to do it again today, it's likely our approach would have been slightly different. The research then builds on previous research by supporting the generality of the assessment and treatment processes. So most of the previous research had been conducted in clinical settings as opposed to in school settings. And it had generally been conducted by researchers and behaviour analysts as opposed to school staff. So our study showed that the procedures were still effective if you implemented it in a school setting and used school staff for that implementation. And you could see in the video it was often noisy and there were lots of people around, lots of moving parts, and still the procedures were effective. And also then these findings extend those positive results to participants who are non-vocal and had intellectual disabilities co-occurring with autism spectrum disorder, because that's something that had been fairly underrepresented in the previous literature. As well, then the staff were able to implement the procedures with fidelity, and they rated them as being acceptable. So unlike what many critics of the processes say, in terms of the procedures including functionally irrelevant contingencies and having to provide escape and tangibles together is too cumbersome, that wasn't the case for these staff. They were able to implement the procedures well, and they liked doing it as well. So it's possible, and there is an argument that analytic precision or identifying one reinforcer for a behavior may be less important than ecological precision. So being very precisely replicating the variables that are operating in the environment. And it may actually be easier for staff to remove a tangible and present a demand, as they might whenever it's time to present a teaching trial, than trying to break those contingencies apart in the name of that analytic precision. So there's an argument to be made there as well. As we saw, then none of the participants generalized that omnibus mad across stimuli. So there are other studies. That was the first time that had happened in the research that had looked at generalization in relation to this process specifically, but it's not the first time that it's happened. when people have taught omnibus mans to people with intellectual disabilities. So there are a few potential explanations for why this might happen. The one that I focused on in the paper and that I think is interesting and potentially relevant is to do with stimulus over-selectivity. So stimulus over-selectivity is when people, particularly autistic people, struggle with generalization across stimuli. Responding is constrained to only a subset of the stimuli that we would expect it to be controlled by. So in terms of the mechanisms that have been found to underlie stimulus over-selectivity, for people with higher intellectual functioning, the thinking is that it may be due to an oversensitive comparator mechanism. So that person may be able to see all elements of the stimulus, but are just focusing very narrowly on one or a few aspects of the stimulus. So for that reason, they don't generalize their responding across other stimuli that don't have those exact features. Whereas with lower intellectual functioning, it has been found that it may be attentional deficits in sampling all elements of the stimulus. So whereas someone with higher intellectual functioning may be able to see the entire stimulus and just over focus on one part of it, for someone with lower intellectual functioning, they may not actually see or attend to or notice all elements of the stimulus, and some of them may be less salient than others. So that means that it may be more difficult for somebody with something like an intellectual disability to actually notice all of the elements of the stimulus and then to generalize their responding across multiple stimuli. It may be easier to address among people with higher intellectual functioning, because you can just teach people that it's not just those specific elements that are important, it's all of the elements. But if somebody has lower intellectual functioning and can't even pay attention to all of the elements at once, that's likely to be a different issue. So it's possible that stimulus over-selectivity is relevant to this study, where the participants, because of their intellectual disabilities, may have been less likely to pay attention to all of the relevant aspects of the context, and so then may have been less likely to generalize their omnibus mand to other similar contexts, such as when other reinforcers were terminated, potentially because of those attentional deficits. So that's the theory that seems to be particularly relevant in any case. There are a few ways that could be addressed. A study that came out this year showed that they were able to establish these omnibus mans for all of the participants' reinforcers. And then before they jumped into those coping skills, that tolerance response training, they taught the participants specifying mans for each reinforcer sequentially. So in this study, participants would have been taught the omnibus man my way, and then a man for, we'll say, escape or for a break, and then a man for their preferred tangible items. So these researchers argued that it's important to teach those omnibus mans to accelerate the elimination of problem behavior that's maintained by multiple synthesized reinforcers. Because once you've identified that very motivating context in which all of the person's reinforcers are delivered, that is a very strong context for teaching replacement skills like an omnibus mand. But then once you've eliminated problem behavior and established that omnibus mand, it may be helpful to teach those specifying mans for particular reinforcers, so that participants can empower or can request momentarily valuable reinforcers. So for Alex, James, and Reese, rather than just teaching them the my way response, it may have been useful to teach them to specify the reinforcers that they were looking for, and then that may have helped with generalization across stimuli as well. There are some limitations to the study, of course. So one is to do with functional control. So as we saw, there were no communication or tolerance responses occurring during the baseline that analysis, but there were no cards, my way cards, or icons on Proloquo to go available during the analysis. So those responses couldn't have occurred during that baseline phase. However, the participants did have their textbooks. Reese had his Proloquo to go, so they could have used their existing communication systems during baseline, and they didn't. The establishing operation always produced problem behavior, so that kind of mitigates that limitation somewhat. We didn't compare the IISCA to other function analysis models. There have been some studies that have done that, and the research has kind of gone either way. It's too big of a debate to get into here, but it's something that we didn't specifically do. We didn't look at more socially impactful outcomes like global functioning and academic performance, and we also didn't look at effects any longer than 4 weeks. So those results are missing from this study as well. So in terms of future research, we would recommend that the generality of the procedure should be further explored by applying the procedures across different settings and different participants. The further studies should measure a broader range of outcomes over longer periods of time, like that global functioning, academic performance, longer maintenance periods as well. Randomized control trials would, of course, provide stronger evidence for the effectiveness of that skill-based treatment or other IISCA-informed interventions. And as I mentioned, more comparative analysis would be helpful in establishing whether or under what circumstances this model is more useful than that of other models, particularly in terms of that cumbersome nature potentially of the treatment that has yet to be compared still. But I would say overall, between the study and then all of the studies that have since been published and that have been published in this area, it is fair enough to conclude that this model of function analysis is a faster and safer form of analysis that informs the development of interventions that are at least as effective as those informed by standard function analysis. So for that reason, I would strongly recommend looking at this approach. You can look at a couple of different resources that I think are particularly helpful. Practical Functional Assessment and FTF-BC are the two websites that are owned by Greg Hanley and his colleagues. So Practical Functional Assessment has a lot of resources, that kind of thing. FTF-BC is his company, FTF Behavioural Consulting, and they run a huge amount of trainings. They do consultation, and that is very helpful. So I would definitely recommend for anybody who wants to learn in depth about this process to do their 10-hour training course. Goes through everything that somebody would need really to get started. And then there are supplemental courses as well. There's a Facebook group for people who are using this approach and to support each other, ask questions, that kind of thing, which is very helpful. Greg Hanley has spoken on the Behavioural Observations podcast. It's a very nice way to kind of introduce yourself to these ideas as well. And my email address is there if anybody wants more information from me or just wants to speak to somebody who has run the process. As I mentioned, I run it obviously as part of this study, and it's something we're incorporating in rehab care as well. And it's my favorite thing to talk about. So if anybody wants to talk to me about it, my email address is there, and there are some references there as well. So thank you very much for listening.
Wow, excellent, Emma.
Thanks.
Yeah, good. There's just so much there, isn't there? The first thing I'd say is we at the beginning, I should have thanked your co-authors as well.
Yes.
Olive Healy, Devin Ramsey, Trish Carolyn, Rona Dempsey, and Jennifer Hollowell. So yeah, they were your co-authors. Like a few things that occurred to me as you were speaking, like just a clarification for those who are like not behavior analysts, or you mentioned at the beginning that you're talking about problem behavior, and we're more used to the term challenging behavior, and that term has fallen out of favor a little bit as well, and people are starting to say concerning behavior or behaviors of concern. But really, what, like, as I understand, these are behaviors that cause a physical risk to the child or others. That's
generally, yes. That you would be looking at dangerous problem behavior. I think the reason the term problem behavior has become kind of standard in this area of the literature is because the behavior is viewed as a problem for the person, the family, the classroom. So it's getting in the way of the person's quality of life in some way. So it's a problem for them as opposed to a problem, with them. Is how I prefer other terms as well, but just to be consistent with, if people are looking up other studies in the area, that is very much the language that's in use. And I think that's why, is because these behaviors are getting in the way of a higher quality of life for the person, I think.
Yeah, and those terms kind of can constrain us, but there's the reason that they're there to be consistent with the existing literature and so on. So you mentioned as well, like the happy, relaxed, and engaged. Now, that's a phrase I've heard Greg Hanley use on some of those podcasts, the Behaviour Observations podcasts. I think it was the first ever Behaviour Observations podcast he was on, wasn't it? So, what does that mean to you? Like, how do you view that?
It looks different for everybody, I suppose, which is why it's that individualized. I only wish it had been common when I was doing the study, because I think it really captures, like, how do you know that somebody is, I suppose, first of all, comfortable and giving assent to be with you and happy to be there, but also that your reinforcement context is actually reinforcing. Because what you can see sometimes is that, say, in a standard analysis or kind of more generally in practice, you can give somebody a reinforcer, but they may not be engaging with it. They may be presenting, agitated or somehow not relaxed. They may seem unhappy. So really making sure like that the person is completely at their baseline, and preferably beyond their baseline, really having a great time before you start going in and establishing operations, just so that the person is ready to work with you and to participate with you. So it is something that has become very central to the process recently. As I mentioned, there's only one paper that has kind of mentioned it so far, but it's very much emphasized in treatment whenever anybody is presenting on it or talking about it, is that idea that we're looking for these indicators that the person is actually being reinforced and, as I say, is actually, participating fully and freely in the process as well.
And that's like putative reinforcer gets that, doesn't it? Because putative means, it's not, we don't know. It's there prior to, we know it's a reinforcer. So it's presumed that it's a reinforcer or whatever. And okay. And you mentioned, so that's great to clarify that, because it's such an important aspect of it, isn't it? It really has to be sensitized to where the child is in that given moment. Otherwise, you're not doing it right.
And you can see it within the video. I think you couldn't get more happy, relaxed, and engaged than, kick back with your shoes and socks off with your fluffy toys. Like, he was happy, relaxed, and engaged in those reinforcement intervals. So it's a good example actually of that as well.
Excellent. And as well as that, it's to see a little boy putting his shoes and socks on, but that was something that was very difficult for him prior to that as well.
Exactly.
And we've all, through the course of our, those of us who are lucky enough to work with children experiencing those kind of things, we know that sometimes, putting on shoes and socks can be quite a difficulty. So so he was happy to do that. You mentioned a couple of times as well, like it's a dignified approach. So what does that mean to you, or what does that come to mean for you?
I suppose another word that you'll see used a lot, and something that is kind of a core, like as much as safety, I suppose, that is emphasized in the process as well, is televisable as well. The idea being that everything that we're doing should very much respect the person's rights, the person's will and preference. It should be something that anybody would be happy to happen to their child, or anybody would be happy to participate in. It's very, I suppose, in the context that I mentioned it as well, it's very much respectful of the person's needs and history, like that, not just saying, well, you're doing this, you're having some self-injury or aggression, I'm going to implement something like a DRO, so don't do that and I'll give you X, Y, and Z, which isn't necessarily something that we would think of as being tailored to those individual contexts and needs. Whereas like that, if you're developing a process like this, where you're very sensitive to, I suppose, very nuanced details of what's important to the person, important enough that they're motivated to engage in these extraordinary behaviors to access it, then looking at that and saying, okay, I can see that this is important to you. Let me teach you how to access it in a way that's not going to be harmful to you, harmful to other people. I think that to me is probably what I mean by dignified, that you are very much seeing the person and seeing what's important to them and making that central to their treatment, and doing it in a way that, like that, you could put it on RT at 6 o'clock and anybody would look at that and say, yeah, that's good stuff.
Right. That's excellent. That's really, really excellent. Yeah, and it's something that's evidently we have a technical precision in our language, which is it's vital in order to be able to communicate with precision about what is meant by different procedures and how they should look. But at root, then, when we start to strip those things away, what we mean is this. Yeah. You also mentioned as well, I won't keep too much longer, I think we've probably ran up against the time here, but ecological precision was a phrase I noticed to use, which I thought was very nice.
Which is like that. It is nice. It's something I hadn't heard of outside of this context. But a lot of the time when we talk about precision, we mean breaking things down, understanding exactly what variables are doing what, whereas which would be that analytic precision, and we are behavior analysts, so that's what we tend to be trained in. But that ecological precision, then looking at in that actual context, what's going on, how can we replicate that very carefully, and that really seems to come into that to the idea of how well the treatments work in practice and not just in a clinic or in a lab, is that if you are replicating like that what's actually going on for the person in the environment, what the staff are seeing all the time, and then just using that exact context that is precisely replicating the ecology of what's going on, and using that to motivate the skills teaching rather than bringing in something that is, I suppose, more artificial or something like that. Again, it comes into the dignity as well. But yeah, it's a nice kind of an idea that we can have analytic precision, but if we aren't looking at how well we're tailoring ourselves to the environment or the ecology, our success is likely to be limited, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so I think we can wrap it up there, can we?
Super, I think so. I mean, as I say, I could talk about it for hours, but I won't.
Yeah, we have avoid
right.
Keep it to the one CEU, like we said.
Exactly.
So just to say thanks very much, and thanks to your co-authors and to the kids that took part and to the school. So thanks a million.
Thanks.
Okay, Emma, all the best.
Bye-bye. Thanks.